George Washington's role in leading the Continental Army is well known in American history. How did Martha Washington contribute to the patriot cause and support the Revolutionary War and the soldiers who fought in it?
Well, Martha was a good general's wife, and of course she sort of created the role as she went along. But it became clear very early on that George wanted Martha to join him once he made winter camp. And so, beginning in 1776, she journeyed up to wherever the winter camp was for that year, and she settled in for the winter, and she made things comfortable for her husband, but more than that, she was a kind of morale booster for the troops in general. They looked to her as a kind of mother figure. They looked to her as kind of a piece of normalcy in a time of great upheaval. She also was a kind of aid to Washington. I mean, the burden of his job was so overwhelming that she at times would write letters, copy letters for him. She and other generals' wives or officers' wives would get together and they would knit, they would do needlework together, they would talk, they would have meals. They generally just tried to keep the spirits up, but keep people functioning in a way that they were most effective in their leadership roles as head of the military. So she had a supportive role, I suppose you would say, but Washington regarded her as crucial. And when he was submitting his expenses to Congress, he included as a request that Congress would reimburse him for the expenses of her travel. And this indicated to us and to him how much he valued her presence and how he regarded it not just as a service to him, but also as a service to the country that she was there.
Did Martha Washington have a political role in the nation's founding?
Of course, it always depends on what you mean by political. She, like other women at the time, could not vote or hold public office, and she wasn't interested in those things. But if you understand political to mean contributing to the overall life of the country, the political life of the country, the creation of a new early American republic, the creation of an independent nation, she very definitely had a role in that. One of the most interesting episodes, I think, was in 1780. A woman named Esther de Burt Reed in Philadelphia got the idea that it would be good if the women of the country showed their support for the troops in some very demonstrable way. And so she promoted the idea that women should go door to door collecting money for the troops. And she wanted to make a presentation to Washington of this money. Now, this was very unusual for women to be so involved in a kind of overtly political matter, but many women in Philadelphia undertook this, and Martha Washington took this as her own cause as well. And she wrote to Thomas Jefferson's wife, who was also named Martha, and asked her to collect money for the cause, and over $300,000 was raised for the support of the troops throughout the country. And so in this way, the women of the country felt that they could show in a very direct way that they supported the troops, and they wanted the money to go for shirts or for socks or for very basic necessities that the troops often lacked during the long war that the Americans were fighting. So in this way, I would say that Martha very definitely saw herself as making a political contribution, and she allied with other women who were doing the same thing.
Tell us something about the years of Martha Washington's widowhood when she ran her deceased husband's estate. Was she good at these duties? Were they uncommon responsibilities for a woman of the time to assume?
Martha was not expecting to be a widow. Her husband died suddenly after only a few years of marriage, but she assumed her role as the new head of household with vigor and dispatch. I mean, she was very good at her role. She was not, or she does not seem to be, intimidated by the new responsibilities that she had. It was not uncommon for husbands to die at this time, but a lot of times when they died, they left a will and they appointed an executor, usually a man, who would administer the estate. Now, Martha Washington was married to one of the richest men in Virginia at this time, Daniel Parke Custis, and since he did die prematurely, he had not made a will, and Martha Washington had to step in then and take over his responsibilities very quickly. And from what we can tell through her correspondence, she just did it immediately, and she started writing to correspondents, merchants, and factors in Europe, in England in particular, ordering new goods for the plantation, ordering supplies, ordering a tombstone for her husband. She just took over right where he had left off, and there doesn't seem to be any reluctance on her part to assume this role. So it was not unusual for women to have to do this, but it was not a role that I'm sure she welcomed, but she didn't shy away from it.
Martha's letters make it clear that family was a recurring and prominent theme in her life. How important was family to her, and what role did family play in her life?
Family was central in her own understanding of herself, in her own emotional life, in the own way she saw herself as a woman. And one of the most touching things I think about Martha Washington's life is how she had to reconstitute her family over and over because of death and disease, and because of the way that destroyed her families. So in her first marriage, 2 of her 4 children died in childhood. Then her husband died. She married George Washington. She, of course, did not have children with him, but George Washington took her 2 children more or less as his own and raised them, and she was very focused on raising them. I mean, she was anxious about their health. She was always worried about them. She was always interested in improving them, making sure that they got the proper education, which was different for a girl than for a boy, but she wanted them to be very well-educated individuals, appropriate to their status, which was as a member of the gentry in Virginia, a leading family of Virginia. Her daughter, Patsy, though, died when she was 17. She was epileptic, and she died very prematurely. Her son died in his 20s, although at this point he had married and already had 4 children of his own. So at that point, Martha Washington again had to remake her family, and again she kind of adopted 2 of her grandchildren and had them live with her at Mount Vernon, and this was with the consent of their mother, but they more or less stayed there constantly, and again she was rearing a family well into her 50s because she regarded her domestic life is really the center of her identity as a woman and of what she could contribute, and it brought so much pleasure to her and joy, along with heartache.
Here at Mount Vernon, George Washington is often referred to as the precedent president. That is, he established important presidential traditions, many of which endure today, despite a lack of existing models. Similarly, Martha Washington was the First Lady. What were some of the specific challenges of this position, and how well do you think she surmounted them? What significant precedents did she set?
Martha Washington was a reluctant First Lady. She really did not desire the role, but as with her widowhood, she assumed it with gusto. I mean, she did it with vigor, and she executed her duties in a most appropriate manner. Like her husband, George Washington, she was very aware that as the First Lady, everything she was doing would be closely watched and probably imitated by subsequent First Ladies. So there was always a caution in what she did. I think that as I say, she was reluctant to take on this role. At one point, very early in George's presidency, she talked about herself as a state prisoner because she was so aware that she couldn't freely go out and be a private citizen in the way she was prior to his taking this office. She was also aware that the entertaining that she did had a public dimension now. It wasn't just strictly social. And very early in George's presidency, she established a precedent of having weekly salons. And these would be gatherings once a week where the important political leaders of Congress, of the cabinets, would come and gather in her drawing room. And it was meant to be sociable, but she was quite aware that this would bring individuals together who might not otherwise want to talk to one another or be in the same room with one another, that this kind of informal socializing would help grease the wheels of government and make political bargaining easier and make it more possible for government to function effectively at a time when, again, the precedents were just being established, when it was unclear exactly what the shape of this new government would be. She was also very aware that she shouldn't act like a queen, and so she had to walk this fine line between, being dignified, having people look up to her, but at the same time not acting regal or having any supposition that she was assuming too much authority to herself. I think the whole idea of this Republican court, of the idea of a weekly salon, was something that subsequent First Ladies did. Dolly Madison did it. Of course, Abigail Adams did it. So it was a more formal and official role for the First Lady than one might have expected. So I think that was an important position. I think other First Ladies subsequently, and I'm thinking particularly of Abigail Adams and Dolly Madison, were more interested in influencing political affairs than Martha Washington was. Martha Washington's home really was with her family, with domestic concerns, and as I mentioned before, she regarded herself as a state prisoner as First Lady. So I think that she did what was required of her, but I think that she wasn't interested in pushing the boundaries of being a First Lady the way some of the subsequent First Ladies were. But that just says that that's the kind of person she was, and she did the best in the job that she could.
Correspondence and other documents indicate that there was a remarkable connection or network among the Founding Fathers. Was there a similar networked connection between Martha Washington and other founding mothers of our nation?
Partly through her winter residence at the General's Camp, Martha Washington met a lot of the so-called founding mothers of the United States. One of the most interesting people she met was Mercy Otis Warren. Warren was a woman who, unlike most women of the time, was very well educated and who had written political tracts and plays opposing British tyranny. She would later go on to write a history of the American Revolution. And her husband was very active in the revolutionary movement as well. So through the connections of their husbands, Martha and Mercy Otis Warren met, and they became very friendly. After the Redcoats withdrew from Boston in 1776, they toured the ruins of the city together, and they were both disturbed by what the British had done. They corresponded in their later lives, and I think it was a person that Martha Washington felt understood what she was going through, could sympathize with her role, and even if she couldn't let down her guard, she could find someone who could really help her understand her role better and give her a kind of understanding that few other people had. Other wives of generals, especially the wife of General Knox, the wife of Nathaniel Greene, became good associates and friends of hers, and she spent many hours with them, and they had a network. Later on, when she became the First Lady, Abigail Adams became a close associate. I don't know if I'd call them friends, but again, only people who shared a similar situation could completely understand what she was going through and sympathize and give her support in this very uncharted territory.
We've always studied the Founding Fathers in school, but in recent years there has been a surge of interest in studying the Founding Mothers. Why do you think that these women and their contributions have been overlooked for so long? And why do you think there is a growing interest in learning more about their contributions?
The most obvious answer is that for a long time, men were the ones who wrote the history. And it is, of course, not until recently that women became very active politically in terms of running for office and serving in office. So I think there's a tendency, once that started to happen, to look back and see what earlier generations did. And I think that's a very useful exercise, and I'm glad we're engaged in it. I think we do have to be careful, though, to understand that Martha Washington and the women of her generation were very different from women today. They didn't have as much education. Most of them didn't aspire to the same kinds of careers as some women today. They had a more limited notion of women's possibilities and roles. And some of them chafed at those constraints. Others were very happy within that role. I would say Martha was very happy within that role and lived that role to the fullest and found a great deal of satisfaction in her role as the wife of George Washington, the mother and grandmother of many children, a good friend. And so I think it's useful to try and see the ways in which Martha Washington is a precursor to the political women of today, but we also have to be aware of the many differences.
What are your ideas of Martha Washington's views on slavery?
It's a very vexed and difficult question. She was a person of her time, and so Martha Washington accepted slavery as a natural institution, as something that was her right. She inherited a lot of slaves from her first husband, and these became part of the George Washington estate, and she never questioned the morality of the institution that we know of. Now, what's interesting is later in his life, her husband, George Washington, did begin to have doubts about slavery and made provision in his will to free his slaves. Since she had slaves that she had inherited from her husband, these slaves were not to be freed until her death, but people were so nervous after her husband died that the so-called dower slaves might try to kill her or poison her or rise up against her, that she actually freed her slaves early. But that seems to be an expediential decision rather than one based on her coming to some realization about the immorality of slavery. She had one slave in particular, a woman named Ona Judge, who was a very close personal slave of hers that ran away at the end of George Washington's presidency, and Martha wanted to stop at nothing, even at kidnapping, to try and get her back. She never did, and Ona Judge lived out her life, the end of her life, in freedom in New Hampshire. So you have to understand her limitations in her understanding of slavery. She was an upper-class woman of Virginia, and while she acceded to her husband's desire to free the slaves, she herself does not seem to have come to as much of a realization as he did about the necessity or the justice of that course of action.